Good morning, everybody, and good evening to those who are joining us from Europe, and good morning to anybody who is joining from the West Coast. My name is Brian Whitmore. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and an associate professor of practice at the University of Texas, Arlington. I'm also the editor and coordinator of the Atlantic Council's ongoing paper series, Russia Tomorrow: Navigating a New Paradigm. This is a series we launched almost 2 years ago under the direction of Ambassador John Herbst, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. The series seeks to illuminate various aspects of Russian politics and foreign affairs and explain what has changed or not changed since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. Past papers have examined topics like the evolution of Putin's inner circle, the geopolitics of Russian energy, public opinion, demographics, and cyber capacity, just to name a few. Today, we are launching the 11th paper in our series, Minsk in Moscow's Grip: How Russia Subjugated Belarus Without Annexation by Hanna Lubakova, which examines the extent of Russian infiltration and capture of the Belarusian state, security apparatus, and economy. Hanna is an award-winning Belarusian journalist and political analyst and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She's reported on developments in Belarus for international media, including The Washington Post, The Economist, and my old employer, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Like all of Hanna's work, this report is thorough, insightful, and comprehensive, and I should know because I helped edit it. So that's enough from me, at least for now. So Hanna, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you for the opportunity to write this report and to share it today. It's been an honor and a pleasure. My research looks at how Belarus has changed since 2020 across different key areas, from military to the economy, to geopolitical sphere, to Russia's growing soft power, and essentially what Belarusians think about all these developments. And we're seeing that all trends point to the one clear pattern that Belarus is being gradually absorbed by Russia, despite all the opposition from people. And I'd like to begin with the first and probably most urgent part, the military sphere. Excuse me, am I back? My internet connection
Yes,
says...
you're back. You're back.
All right, so I'm not sure when I disconnected, but I'll start from the military sphere from the beginning, because it clearly illustrates, it shows how Belarus has turned from just an ally to basically a military outpost of the Russian state. I'll start with the invasion, but very briefly, we all know that Belarus allowed Russian troops to attack Ukraine from its territory in February 2022. Yes, Lukashenko did not send his own soldiers, but he helped in every other way. And I think that's really important to mention, highlight, and remember, because we tend to forget that he enabled basically the invasion. Russia had full access to Belarusian airfields, railways, roads, and even oil refineries. Even wounded Russian soldiers, including war criminals, were treated in Belarusian hospitals. But this is a more known aspect. I will now switch to the nuclear aspect, because here there have been some developments as well. Simultaneously with the invasion, the Lukashenko regime held a fake, falsified referendum that deprived Belarus of its nuclear-free constitutional status. And as a result, by the end of 2022, the regime said Russian Iskander missile systems and air defense units were already stationed and operational. Back then, there were reports that a new garage facility for the nuclear-capable Iskander launchers was constructed at an existing military base in Osipovichy, which is central Belarus. And here I have the slide for that. You can see that the picture with the kind of football field, that's where the base is, and that's probably where we have the Iskander launchers in Belarus at the moment. Next step was in 2023, Putin and Lukashenko announcing the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. Whether they're fully deployed or not, we don't know because there have been no visual confirmation of the deployment, but we have seen in the past year the preparations. And these preparations, the expansion of the infrastructure is real. Satellite images show nuclear storage facilities being upgraded near Osipovich. So that's basically a neighboring site to that base that I mentioned earlier. It's very close to that kind of garage with Iskanders. What does it mean? Potential deployment of Russian nukes in Belarus does not change much on the battlefield, but this move is meant to unsettle NATO. If Belarus becomes a nuclear base, the country also becomes a target for a potential retaliation in the future. Of course, these nukes, if they're there or if they will be there, they will be Russian controlled. Fast forward to today, around 2,000 Russian troops remain stationed in Belarus. That's probably not because Lukashenko told them to go, but because Russia needs them elsewhere. And despite Lukashenko's pro-peace rhetoric, recent developments, including most recent drone incursion into Poland, with drones originating from the Belarusian territory, show that Belarus continues to be used for military purposes by Russia. So militarily, Belarus is no longer just Russia's ally, it's part of Russia's military machine. Now let's switch to the economy, because that's another sphere that shows the dependence on Russia that is overwhelming. If we look at exports that go directly to Russia, we see that around 70% of such trade goes there. But if we look at transit, if we look at ports and railways that are being controlled by Russia, Moscow effectively controls more than 19% of Belarus outbound trade because of the western route being closed right now for Belarus. Key sectors such as potash and oil are especially vulnerable. Last year, there was an example when at St. Petersburg port, there was a kind of dispute over pricing, and Belarusian fertilizer shipments were delayed, were suspended. And that, I think, essentially shows that Russia can easily hold Belarusian export overnight to assert control. When it comes to other aspects and facts, Belarus owes about $8 billion to Russia, making it Moscow's largest debtor. And last year, Kremlin even gave Lukashenko a 7-year delay on repayment, basically a reward for loyalty. Now let's briefly discuss sanctions, because that's one of the kind of disputed areas and factors when it comes to policies to Belarus and what to do with them. Western sanctions hit the economy hard. I will show now the slide. So you see that in 2022, they triggered a 4.7% GDP drop. In the following 2 years, the economy was able to rebound, but not through reform or innovation. That was because of largely Russian demand and market access. And the downside of this is clear. When Russia's economy is slowing down, the Belarusian economy also feels that, again, because of this dependence. So far this year, you can see the predictions from the World Bank, but so far this year, the growth has been only 1.6%, so it's much slower than in the previous years, and it shows that this kind of GDP growth won't be possible, and the predictions are even kind of slower in the next years. At the same time, Belarus has become deeply involved when it comes to Russia's military supply chain. According to the exiled security forces officers, Belpol, the organization, more than 280 state enterprises support Russia's war machine right now with delivering, producing components for whatever Russia needs, from basically chips, electronics, from artillery shells, and so on and so forth. But with the problems in Russia, Lukashenko wouldn't be Lukashenko if he wouldn't be looking for some alternative ways and countries where he can reach out. And these are markets in Asia. I will briefly focus on foreign policy and the changes that also happened in the past years. China is one of the most interesting examples. I think most recently, that's apart from Russia, the country became the declared priority for Belarus, for the Lukashenko regime. They call it a strategic partner, and Lukashenko is being accepted on the highest level there. Last year, Belarus joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, presenting this as a geopolitical pivot to Asia. But in reality, this relationship is shallow and one-sided. Trade between China and Belarus is highly asymmetric. Basically, Belarus buys much more than it sells to Russia. So all this rhetoric that China is such a strategic partner, such an important sort of donor for Belarus, it shows that it's, at least when it comes to trade, Belarus doesn't get much from it. But Belarus obviously still serves as a transit route for China's Belt and Road Initiative. Sanctions, however, have hit this role quite hard. Most recently, when Poland shut its border with Belarus, which was related to security concerns around the Zapad military exercises last September, a Chinese delegation visited both Warsaw and Minsk, showing that it has leverage there. Chinese technology is also entering Belarus defense industry. There was an investigation showing that Belarusian factories used Chinese optical components for Russian tanks. Most previously, the two countries have co-developed the Apollon-S multiple launch rocket system. And there are some other developments. Last year, there was even joint military Chinese drills on the NATO borders. So there is definitely some cooperation. Lukashenko is not priority for China. China is not investing as much as Lukashenko would like to show. However, on the political level, there is definitely sort of mutual coordination and support. And obviously, Lukashenko is also supporting sort of Beijing's position on Taiwan and Hong Kong. So he's been kind of useful to China. When it comes to another emerging partner, it is Iran, where the defense collaboration also increased in the past years. Defense ministers from both countries have met repeatedly. There was a number of agreements that have been signed between the two countries. But I think what is most interesting, and I'm going to show you the picture, it's the Iran strike drone that was presented last year during the military parade in Minsk, and that it closely resembled the Shahed model used by Russia and Ukraine, while previously there were also rumors that Iran might be building a factory to produce such drones in Belarus. And now I would mention something kind of more recent, and probably something that I didn't focus that much in the report because I submitted it earlier, but nevertheless, it's very important. It's the outreach of the Lukashenko regime to the United States. Since early this year, with the US mediation, about 70 political prisoners and foreign nationals have been released. In exchange, Washington has suspended sanctions on Belavia, the Belarusian state airline. And it was in my recommendations that President Trump would appoint special envoy to the Belarusian Democratic Forces, which partially happened because on Sunday, President Trump appointed John Cole, a special envoy to Belarus, who will be discussing the release of more political prisoners. And most recently, something that Lukashenko probably really dreamed of before the Alaska summit, President Trump even called Lukashenko. The contact on such a high level hasn't happened in the past years. For the regime in Belarus, this obviously means that they want to get out of isolation. That's their priority. Lukashenko also wants sanctions to be lifted. For Washington, the issue might be humanitarian. This is the issue of prestige, of releasing political prisoners. But obviously, without real change in the end of repression, this could become a never-ending story, or worse, even a cynical business model, because Lukashenko could get even more hostages and even more prisoners. And another development, yesterday, John Cole had a call with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the leader of the Democratic Forces. So let's see how this will be developing. But definitely that was one of my recommendations. I couldn't imagine this would happen before the report would be launched but here we are. I will be wrapping up, but there are several things that I also wanted to mention. First of all, that there is also Russian increasing presence in the kind of cultural sphere, is growing influence. There is even a joint media holding under the framework of the Union State that received $11 million for its development. The Russian kind of language domination in Belarus is also growing because there are less and less schools in the Belarusian language. Propaganda is omnipresent, while before that was sort of toned down, controlled, not to mention censored, obviously, but some Russian TV shows were kind of edited. Now all these pro-Kremlin views dominate the narrative, so that's definitely some development that I also described in my report, and I encourage you to follow. And very kind of briefly, but also importantly, on the views of Belarusians, because we tend to forget that kind of people's views, societal views are also very important. And what we see that despite all these kind of pro-Russian developments in Belarus, right, Belarus being more and more dependent, Belarusians want independent path. Only marginal amount of people want Belarus to be part of Russia. However, they want to preserve good relations with the Russian state, obviously, for many reasons. We can mention them. But Belarusians are against being part of the invasion. They are against the nukes deployment in Belarus. So all of this shows that here we still have leverage, we still have access and outreach, and people's views definitely are kind of on the side of more pro-democratic, pro-European side. So in short, Belarus is a country under pressure, but not without hope. And I hope that we will be discussing what can be done to help Belarusians with their aspirations and what to do when it comes to the policies against the regime. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanna, for that very comprehensive presentation. We're going to do a moderated discussion now for about 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to switch to audience questions. I want to remind those of you watching, you can ask questions of the panelists at askac.org. That's askac.org. Briefly, I want to introduce our panelists. Agnia Grigas is a non-resident senior fellow at the Eurasia Center here at the Atlantic Council. She's also the author of one of my favorite books, Beyond Crimea, the New Russian Empire, which I will be referencing in the discussion. Giselle Bosset is the professor and Jean Monnet Chair in EU Foreign Policy and International Relations in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Maastricht University. I want to start out with you, Hanna, and something you didn't cover in your presentation, but something I still have a lot of questions about. You opened your report with the false dawn of 2015 to 2020, when the Lukashenko regime appeared to open to the West and a rift with Russia appeared to be very real. The operative word here is appeared, or at least to some people. How do you interpret this period and its aftermath? Was this just a ruse on the part of the Lukashenko regime, or was there a genuine factional dispute in the elite? I mean, I remember writing about the factional disputes between Vladimir Mekhai on one hand and Igor Shunevich on the other, over how Belarus should proceed. Did the reality of Russia's grip on Belarus just sit in? How do you see happening here? How do you explain that period? Because it was a weird period.
Well, it's been definitely weird, but not maybe in the context of the whole history of independent Belarus. And Brian, you know that we had some limits of words, because otherwise I would actually start with 1994 when Lukashenko came to power. And since the beginning, he leaned toward Russia. And I briefly actually write about that because he courted Russian elites. He traveled to Russian regions, showing himself as this Soviet-style manager. There were even reports that he dreamt of being kind of the head of the Union state. essentially a Kremlin-level role. And that's something that we probably should mention in the first place when it comes to Russia setting in. That was your question, because 1999, the year when the Union State Treaty was created, was signed, and that created a legal framework for deep integration that for more than 2 decades, Lukashenko stalled, because even if he had these ambitions to become kind of the head of the Kremlin, we don't know for sure, but definitely with Boris Yeltsin, who was weak, and then Putin, who came to power in his rise, definitely Lukashenko's ambitions probably finished here. The first signs of diversification from Russia came around 2008 when Lukashenko refused to recognize South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And fast forward to the period that you're asking about, that was the real turning point in 2014 because of Crimea annexation and because of the war that broke out in Donbass. And suddenly for Lukashenko, that meant that Belarus could have been another target. And there were even gestures that Lukashenko made. He spoke for 1-2 minutes in the Belarusian language for the first time in 20 years. He hosted the Minsk talks. He even traveled to Kiev. So there were kind of several things that he did. Of course, still he avoided criticism of Russia directly, but he showed that kind of limited independence without provoking Moscow. So that was one reason why that was happening, that kind of opening up, and that kind of balance that he tried to preserve, to kind of sit on the fence between East and West. That's something that he has done for years, but that was most visible back then. But also another reason that why I focus so much on the economy, right? I know on all these issues, and we also tend to forget that back then, obviously, the economy was tied to Russia, and that was clear. And because of the oil prices and because of Russia's recession back then and sanctions that hit back then, that also exposed Belarus' vulnerabilities in the economic sphere. And there was even a moment when these kind of reformists, sort of economists who were pro-reforms, rose in power, right? And there were kind of several names that we can mention, but that was kind of also visible how Lukashenko all of a sudden turns to that kind of the other direction, not because he wanted real kind of opening up to the West, or he changed his mind and he suddenly became not so pro-Russian, because it was a tactical step to first increase his probably negotiation power when it comes to speaking with Russia, but also helping his own economy, to kind of stabilize, and his own position to be again stronger. And very briefly on Mackay Shunevich, well, they ended very different. Right? Because Mackay died, but there were different people, because Mackay wanted this kind of pragmatic engagement with the West, while Shunevich was clearly very pro-Russian. But that doesn't really change much, because they did not have independence that would allow them to kind of fight for power, and they were still very loyal to Lukashenko, and that's something that Lukashenko kind of that we should count, right? That there won't be anyone with enough independence inside the elites at the moment. They are all very loyal, and if anyone would like to show dissent, they would be probably either in jail or had to leave the country.
Thank you. I want to stick with this because this is relevant right now. I mean, the U.S. is easing sanctions, and there is a possibility that this process may be repeated in a very unfortunate way. And in this way, I want to go to Giselle. Giselle, in an article for Democracy Hub last month, you warned against repeating the mistakes of 2015 to 2020. with Belarus, as the U.S. seems to be shifting towards sort of kind of engaging Lukashenko or easing sanctions. You wrote the following: even limited diplomatic contact could grant Minsk legitimacy and reinforce the regime's propaganda narrative of indispensability and stability. The EU must not copy Washington's approach or repeat the mistakes of re-engagement. You also recommend intensified engagement with the opposition and civil society, including establishing a democracy support fund, increasing diaspora diplomacy, and strengthening exile infrastructure. How do you see EU policy toward Belarus going forward in this environment? And what are the limits of that if the US is in a different place?
Yes, a very, very good question, and I think also a very good report that comes into this very important debate right now. I think that in the European Union, at least at the official levels, there's no discussion as such on whether there should be a re-engagement with Lukashenko. There are clandestine low key and not reaching higher levels. What I think the EU is doing and continues to do is to recognize that Belarus plays an essential role in the circumvention of sanctions that are imposed by the European Union, and they have recognized this officially also in the sanction policy since 2024. Where they have officially coupled all the sanctions that are put or imposed against Belarus that are also then paralleled or mirrored with sanctions on Belarus. And that is important recognition, and I don't see the EU moving away from this approach at all. There is discussion: are the sanctions effective? As Hannah already pointed out, I mean, we see very clearly, at least as the sanctions that are directly targeted at the Belarusian regime are concerned, we are mainly talking about sources of revenue. It's not that we are expecting regime change or any other major developments. But I think one of the key aspects or goals of these sanctions is to reduce sources of revenue. And as we saw on the slide, and our information confirms this as well, that for the regime they lost, with exports of potash and oil sector between 16 and 18 billion US dollar per year. Since the imposition of sanctions. And as Hannah also pointed out, these are not easily compensated by redirecting exports to Russian Federation. I mean, Russia exports potash as well. And actually what they've done is they have sent their potash to Belarus for them to relabel them and then still export it also to European Union. So the EU now in its latest sanctions package has actually recognized this amongst other sanction evasion practices, and now put the cap on the or tariffs on how much potash can be exported, exactly to prevent these kind of practices. Anyway, so there has been an impact, and of course more relevant than this, as I just mentioned, this overarching and that remains a strategic priority of the European Union, with one or two member states, for example, Hungary, always causing some trouble here, but there has been full backing of this 19th sanction package recently, where again Belarusian banks were targeted. These potash exports as mentioned, and also new measures stopping the shadow fleet that's operated by Russian but also by Belarusian vessels. And a couple of extra measures on this. So the EU is, following this course of reinforcing these sanctions and then targeting Belarus in particular as a hub to evade sanctions. And at the same time, the EU does support the democratic forces of Belarus. They have invested now 170 million and diverted all the money that first went to the regime. They've frozen all this support after 2020. This has all been redirected to the Belarusian forces in exile. Of course, more can be done, but in the absence of US aid, for example, it's been quite important that this money has come through. And then maybe to finish, other developments where the EU has also been rather active is backing, for example, the special tribunal on the crime of aggression against Ukraine, because this also has theoretically jurisdiction over crimes of aggression, including the role of Lukashenko's regime. And here member states have also been quite active for this tribunal to also have this specific coverage. And that is then also by Council of Europe, of course, set up and recognized. And then we have also Lithuania as one example of a member state who referred Belarus and Lukashenko regime to the International Criminal Court, to the prosecutor, and there's now ongoing preliminary investigations into Belarusian war crimes. You probably all also heard about this, but that Belarus since 2022 has approximately, or at least deported 2,500 children from Russian occupied territories of Ukraine, and they have been deported mostly to Belarusian camps, which is forced deportation. And here there is a count of potential war crimes. And so here there's a big element, I think, in the EU's policy, and that stays like this, is this accountability and holding the regime to account. So it's not about big regime change, no. It's not about short-term, impacts or re-engagement. I think the EU has also learned from past mistakes there. So for the time being, what I see is focus on sanctions, and then also, the support in various ways for the democratic forces.
Thank you, Giselle. I want to move to Agnia now. Agnia, in your 2016 book, which I loved, Beyond Crimea, the New Russian Empire, you outlined a 7-step escalatory re-imperialization process that Russia deploys in the post-Soviet space that begins with things like soft power and support for the Russian language and culture, and ends up with armed intervention, frozen conflicts, and annexation. Belarus is obviously a different kind of a case from the ones you examined in Beyond Crimea, but not that different, really. How would you fit what we have seen in Belarus, the re-imperialization, if you will, into the framework that you laid out in your book, or does it just not fit into that framework? Do we need a different framework when we're looking at Belarus?
Absolutely. And I wanted to thank you for being here and thank Hannah for such an excellent report and such important research that has been done. So, in my book, I do examine Belarus and Armenia together as these kind of unique cases. And I believe that Belarus does fit the re-imperialization model, but in a much more compressed and accelerated format. And in fact, I came to a similar conclusion back in the book in 2016, as I think Hannah does in her report, essentially seeing that Belarus, it may have thought it was an ally, or it may have been treated an ally, but it really has become a target. And this re-imperialization in the case of Belarus really occurred not by creating separatists as more, in Georgia, in Ukraine, but really capturing the regime itself. But again, we see many similar types of policies. If we look at soft power or these like compatriot policies, Moscow views Belarus itself as all of it as compatriots. I mean, there has been, they say it's one people, essentially, that the Belarusians and the Russians are indistinguishable in the eyes of the Kremlin. And there's also been economic incentives and support, economic support for Belarus and the Belarusian people. And that's really through the subsidized oil, gas, and different market access. And we see that's, again, in the report that's continuing to present day. And again, this level of indebtedness that Russia has used with other countries in the past, and Ukraine even in the past, use it in Armenia, to then use the indebtedness as a means of influence. So I think where we really look at, where we've seen some crises elsewhere and this creation of separatism and annexation, in Belarus 2020 really was the turning point when the Lukashenko regime lost legitimacy and Russia really became, in essence, the guarantor of his regime. So this, in essence, I think allowed Moscow to bypass some of these steps in my framework and essentially capture the regime itself by achieving military integration, troop presence, joint command structures, full access to the Belarusian territory. I mean, and even, of course, the use of the territory to attack Ukraine in 2020.
Yeah, thank you. I want to stick with you for a moment, Agnia, because I understand you're in Lithuania at the moment.
Yes.
And I wanted to get kind of the view from the front line. Your native Lithuania and Latvia, as well as Poland, all face a very real immediate security challenge from Russia's capture of Belarus, right? What can and should these frontline states be doing to meet the security threat that they're not doing right now, especially as the U.S. retrenches,
Mhm.
possibly?
I think first and foremost is really the realization, which I think in some ways is, I don't know whether it's fully there, whether that realization has really penetrated European countries, the United States, that Belarus is not an independent actor, that Minsk, that Lukashenko is not an independent regime. And essentially, this is, part of that captured state, part of the Union state already. And Lithuania already has, I am in Vilnius, Lithuania has already faced a number of hybrid attacks from Belarus. There's one going on right now, and that's with the airspace violations by sending these contraband balloons. They contain either contraband like cigarettes or propaganda materials. And while this may seem, maybe rather well, somewhat innocent, but in reality, when they violate the airspace, they create air safety risks. The airports have been closed here extensively. And it's being perceived really more of as a intentional probing tool to see what NATO reaction times are, what's the radar coverage. And as a response, when Lithuania closed its border, Belarus has taken captive essentially Lithuanian transportation drivers. So again, it's a type of hostage diplomacy, quite a serious situation right now, to be used as leverage against Lithuania. In the past, again, this Poland, Lithuania have experienced weaponized migration operations from Belarus, where refugees were being sent in a coordinated fashion from Belarus into Lithuania and into Poland. And that was again used kind of as a political weapon to test Lithuania's and European Union's unity, along with a plethora of, at the time, propaganda, disinformation. And today there's a sizable presence of Belarusians in Lithuania. A lot of them are, fleeing the regime, opposition leaders, and just people, I'd probably say economic migrants as well. But along with that, there's also been really kind of espionage and intelligence operations. There's been efforts by the Belarusian KGB to recruit drivers, traders, dual citizens, to try to co-opt some of the smuggling networks for intelligence gathering. So I would say that Lithuania right now is in a kind of like a hybrid confrontation already with Belarus.
Thank you, Agnia. I'm going to go to Giselle and then wrap up the moderated discussion with Hannah for the final question there. And again, I want to remind our audience, you can ask a question of any of the panelists at askac.org. Giselle, I've been looking at what you've been writing and saying in preparation for this event. In an interview earlier this month, you argued the following. You said what happened in 2020 was a political revolution that didn't win, but it planted the seeds for a democratic culture. The regime has silenced the streets, but not the spirit inside the country's civic life now continues quietly in small reading groups, community clubs, even underground solidarity networks for political prisoners. These are forms of resistance that can survive authoritarianism. I'd like you to briefly elaborate on that. And given the conditions described in this report and the near total state capture by Russia, how can this manifest itself? Because it seems to me there are two opponents of democratic Belarus right now, the Lukashenko regime and Russia. Any successful democratic movement in Belarus would immediately have to face potentially a Russian invasion. So could you elaborate on those thoughts, which I agree that 2020 changed the game entirely in Belarus, but I'd like to hear you elaborate on that a bit.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I think it's also a very important point. Well, I think I would go even further than what you said. I think that in Belarus, what we see is a strong tendency to develop into a, fully fledged totalitarian regime. Right? This is no longer an autocracy. And I think it's very important to recognize this because, every independent structure, organization, media, NGOs is banned. We have a systematic repression, we have institutionalized repression, and we have, the attempt to exercise total control over all aspects of social, political, and civic life. And I think that is something we have to recognize as such as well. And maybe not fully mentioned in the report. I think it's partly mentioned, but of course we have a strong collaboration also between Belarusian KGB and the Russian FSB, the intelligence sharing, surveillance operations, tracking, targeting of dissidents, forced, abductions. We see shared data sets, extremist lists, you name it, joint cyber surveillance. Russian IT companies literally have full control over the Belarusian internet. So, these are just, small features in this as well. So, yes. So we have total control over society. Yet, and we know that from the past, and I think we also always have to remember this, that all attempts at total control over society never fully succeed. Right. And I think with this, when we are looking, at the idea of democratic opposition, or successful democratic the opposition, I think we have to rethink, a little bit our definitions of what a successful democratic movement is, because otherwise, I think if we use measures, such as regime change or mass mobilization, we very, very quickly overlook the democratic forces that are still present and active. And there has been, this very, very important, fascinating research by Belarusian scholars in exile, like Sokolova and Sparaga, for example, who are talking about, what connects the political community in Belarus. And of course, it's not the community as you can imagine it in the normal sense, but it's one that is, disconnected. We have diaspora that is basically, looking or that's focusing on visibility, resources, external advocacy, these kind of things, and then of those people inside have microspaces of civic agency or informal networks, cultural circles, and so on and so forth. And I think the argument this year is not to reinforce this division that the Belarusian regime likes to talk about in its propaganda. We have these foreign agents, the extremists, the traitors, and then we have the Belarusians at home, who stayed, and these are the patriots. And that's, of course, pure propaganda. And sometimes I think it was our idea of, what is successful democratic movement. We unconsciously and unintentionally play into this, and we shouldn't really do this. And so, what we can look at is, for example, there are still these cultural bonds, shared language, literary traditions, symbols. Also, what Sokolova was writing about is this, common existential concerns, right, about common fate. That creates solidarity. Everybody has an experience of state violence as a collective trauma, but also hope. Threats to family members and friends that's shared by those inside Belarus, but also those in exile. So it's really important to keep this in mind. And there's also solidarity practices. For example, political prisoners, support for them and their families. Now, this is in exile. The democratic forces are working on this, but also inside the country, there's the Belarusian House in Warsaw and other organizations that support this. We also have cultural initiatives. I'm just naming a few, just to show that democratic civic life exists. It's contested and it's fragile, but it's alive. There's free theater, for example, of Belarus still continues operations in exile, and they maintain connections with, the domestic or people, who are still inside the country. So there is this element also, that we have to pay attention to. There's solidarity, there's mutual care, and there's also, a shared collective trauma and hope. And I think, and that of course also we have digital technologies and the space there that's also rather new and can be used for political representation and discussion. And all these solidarity, trust, care, right? These are forms of resistance, and also, democratic civic life, and that is still maintained. And I think the democracy support by the EU and others has to focus on this a little bit more, recognize this. And there's a lot of support for the forces in exile, but maybe more could be done to support cultural production, language, cultural memory, this kind of support, and of course also safe spaces. Talking about Lithuania and the incidents of removing the security, personal security for Tikhanovskaya, which I understand was now changed again, reinstated. But nevertheless, there is a lot more that can be done to create safe spaces and to remove or also, here protect also democratic forces outside the country more effectively and make them less vulnerable towards, let me put this like, short-term, political gains that may be happening when coalitions and governments might change, as in Lithuania. So.
Great. Thank you, Giselle. And I want to bring it back to Hannah for the last part of the panel discussion, and then we're going to go to audience questions. We got about 14 minutes left. Hannah, the report paints a very, very bleak picture of state capture by Russia. I've called this soft annexation. What I want to kind of close out with is, how complete is this capture? Are there any fissures or factions within the state, within the security services, within the military, within law enforcement that are really opposed to the current path? Or have all of these elements been completely purged and the state is completely captured?
Thank you, Brian. Well, my goal was indeed to show how state is being dependent on Russia. It does not mean that there is no hope. It does not mean that people want to be, society wants to be Russian society, to be part of the Russian state. Well, this is not true, right? And that's why I also mentioned what Belarusians wanted, what Belarusians think, something that, again, we keep ignoring, but it's so, so important, because they're still, people are still the important actor of change and also of influence inside the country. Belarus is formally independent, and that's a value, and that's something that we should be kind of fighting for, should be, attempting to preserve. In practice, for now, Belarus' freedom is extremely limited, and Russia uses the territory of Belarus. It used it for attacking Ukraine, as we have already discussed, and most recently for the drone incursion. And that's something that I want to mention again, because this might repeat. And as we probably imagine, next year, there might be even more of such attacks. And that's where also Russia can be sort of more influential. And that's how Russia can use Belarus yet again. Before, there were also, we mentioned migration crisis, but also Wagner mercenaries that were sent to Belarus, right? That's also how Russia used the territory of my country. But if Russia weakens, Belarus might gain some space to maneuver, even with Lukashenko, and not to mention if there is transition. But with Lukashenko, that wouldn't mean that he would have some sort of reform or become friendlier to the West. He's not going to change. He's the one who has always chosen Russia, and he always will. So let's not have this kind of naive thinking, imagination that we can bring him closer to the West. For him, it's a tactical step. It's either to, again, negotiate with Russia to have stronger position, or to help his economy. And by the way, another number, you notice that I like numbers. There is currently a trade deficit at $4.5 billion right now in Belarus, and that's why this outreach to the West, that's why this kind of pro-peace rhetoric that Lukashenko is now using. There are also several developments that I didn't mention, but I will just briefly say that last year Belarus and Russia signed this security guarantees, and Belarus also renewed, kind of readopted its military doctrine. Both allow the permanent presence of Russian military base in Belarus and also kind of Russian nuclear presence. And we already see consequences of this. Lukashenko, that now there are conversations about Oreshnik being deployed to Belarus. And most recently, Lukashenko said that yes, we need Oreshnik, but we actually don't need Poseidon, or we don't need Burevestnik. A few hours later, Moscow responded that, well, we can actually deploy any weapons if we want in Belarus. So that's how Moscow also treats Belarus, right? That they can do anything. That said, independence isn't gone forever. Giselle mentioned all the examples of how Belarusian society remains strong. Again, I mentioned some sociology in my report, and I think that's still super, super important to preserve that, to have people who are on kind of our side, people who want independence and who want to see Belarus as kind of more, pro-European and open and obviously democratic.
Thank you, Hannah. And that brings us to the end of the moderated discussion. I'm going to go to, we have about 9 minutes left. We can get a couple of questions in if everybody's really brief. I'm going to try to choose those that were not covered in the discussion. And there's a good one from Adriana Duric. What is the significance of Belarus not being formally annexed, yet operating effectively as a satellite state? What advantages does this arrangement provide for the Lukashenko regime and for Moscow? And I hope I'm showing that on the screen. I don't know if I am. But Hannah, do you want to tackle that? Or anybody else want to jump in on that? Like, what are the advantages of this type rather than fully just annexing it?
I can just briefly start, but please others jump in. So I'll just say that first, if we obviously have independence and we preserve it, we maintain it, then that's it. We will be able to rebuild it in the future. Whatever happens with Russia, there will be, anyways, there will be some changes in the future. That's not going to be status quo forever. I don't mean immediately liberal changes, but definitely there will be some developments. So that's crucial. And while Belarus has independence, and it's able to maintain it, then we just have it. Russia does not need to formally, legally annex Belarus, and again, luckily so. For now, it believes that it has full control. That's only partially true. Again, that was not my intent was not to show that Belarus is just fully controlled by Russia, but the state is controlled, and that Lukashenko has very little room for maneuver. While again, there are many things that have been decided on the level of Belarus inside the country by either Lukashenko or officials. And again, having society that does not want Russia to occupy, that does not want to be part of Russia fully, right, integrated or being kind of formally the Russian state is very crucial. And that's something that Belarusians have shown for decades that they just don't want this kind of annexation, that they don't want to join Russia.
Anybody else want to jump in on that? Yeah.
I'll jump in briefly. The benefits for Russia, of course, it's the lower cost scenario, right? It's a lower cost of controlling the state without war, as in the case of Ukraine. Clearly, efforts to take over Ukraine have costed Russia a lot more, I think, than they even initially anticipated.
Okay. Another question along the same lines. And I'm going to read the question, then put it up. I'm unsure if President Lukashenko will simply accept a full Russian takeover. If so, is military resistance, including guerrilla action, expected, or are the Russians more likely to overthrow Lukashenko, first hoping that it will reduce potential opposition? That's from Patrick Dalzell. This is a question I've wondered about. If Russia ever really wanted to go for the full annexation, would they get rid of Lukashenko first, because he is erratic and not seen as entirely reliable by the Russians, and certainly by Putin. He and Putin detest each other personally, is in my understanding, and certainly do not trust each other. Anybody want to tackle that one?
No worries, I can take that. So Well, first, yes, I don't think that the two of them like each other very much, but there is this saying in Russia, "Коней на переправе не меняют." I don't know how to explain it in English, but now there is this moment when, of course, for Putin, Lukashenko is the best partner in crime, literally, and he is the most pro-Russian politician in Belarus. There is no one else. Even the obviously opposition that existed legally, formally before inside the country, they were pro-Western opposition, that they were not, pro-Russian. So he is the one who Putin considers the partner and will consider. And again, we've been discussing that Putin might change him for, I think, decades at this point. He never did. When it comes to guerrilla movements and such, I wouldn't exclude that. We are talking about ourselves as the nation of partisans. That's obviously kind of a joke, but to a certain extent only. When the invasion, full-scale invasion began, we had railway partisans. We had people who attempted to stop and stopped, slowed down the movement of Russian troops in Belarus, and that to a very large extent help Ukrainians as well. These people were very harshly punished. They were even shot. So there was this kind of very cruel response from the regime, but it still showed how people, were willing to resist that war. So that's just one example how that could potentially happen.
Agnia, Giselle, any thoughts on this?
Maybe I could just add, I think that's also from the Western policy. I think there's other groups or parties who also don't necessarily want to see a change in Lukashenko. I think for the EU, I mean, one scenario is Lukashenko, but I think the other scenario is, okay, there's suddenly no Lukashenko anymore, or he's being replaced. And I think there's no strategy in place whatsoever, how to deal with this situation. Neither whether it's, from a democratic uprising, a change, or it's a change, that is, imposed or just sort of engineered by the Russian Federation. There's no strategy, and I think the most main interest is, I think, to have the, country as stable as possible. And I would say, this works very much in contradiction with, a policy that's focused on democratic forces. But you have this ambiguity in the EU's or Western policies, but you've had it all along, all the time. So maybe just to add this.
Great, thank you. And we got a couple of minutes left, Agni. I know we got a hard stop at 2. Did you want to add anything, or should I wrap it up?
Well, my last words, I think the future of Belarus is greatly tied to the future of Russia, unfortunately, at least as it appears today. And I think that stability, I mean, it's perhaps some sort of blessing is disguise. I don't know. I mean, it's maybe the least worst of the current scenarios, and hopefully the Belarusian people can maintain their hope for independence, and that underground opposition can remain until better times.
Yep. Well, that's a good way to close out. I always like to close out on something somewhat optimistic. So that wraps up our discussion. I urge everybody to read this excellent report, which is available online at atlanticcouncil.org. I want to thank Hanna Lubakova, the author, award-winning journalist, and non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, and Agnia Grigas, also a non-resident senior fellow at the Eurasia Center, and Giselle Bozet, professor and Jean Monnet chair in EU and foreign policy and international relations at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Maastricht University. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you.